When the train stopped, Emil Hartmann looked through the dirty glass and felt his stomach tighten. He had spent the last 8 days crossing a country so large it had stopped feeling real somewhere after the second sunset. Every time he thought America had shown him its full size, another day of window scenery proved him wrong. First, the harbor on the east coast, with its cranes and steel and enormous organized motion. Then factories that stretched along the tracks for miles, their smokestacks working without apparent interruption. Then towns, then rivers wider than anything he had seen in Germany. Then plains so open they made him feel exposed even from inside a locked train car. Now, at last, the doors opened, and this was where America had decided to put him. Not in a city, not in a fortress, not in a prison anyone back home would have recognized. Just sky. A gigantic, empty western sky, pale blue and merciless, stretching above a landscape of dry grass, low hills, and a road that seemed to lead nowhere a human being would willingly go. Emil stepped down from the train with the other prisoners and squinted in the afternoon light. The wind was different here. It came hard and clean across the open land, carrying dust and the smell of dry earth and sun-baked timber. He stood still for a moment and let it hit him because standing still was the only honest response to arriving somewhere this large and this indifferent. There was a station platform, a water tower, a handful of army trucks idling in the heat, and beyond them, nothing that looked like confinement. No high walls, no layered coils of barbed wire, no machine gun towers, no concrete guard posts standing at intervals against the sky. He turned slowly, scanning the horizon in a full circle, certain he had missed something. A prison camp had to declare itself. That was the point of a prison camp. It had to tell you what it was the moment you saw it, had to make its intention visible so that the prisoner understood his position immediately and completely. This place looked like a military outpost at the edge of the world, which was either a very sophisticated form of intimidation or something he did not yet have the right category for. He was 26 years old, born in Dresden, the son of a printer and a school teacher. He had been a soldier for 3 years, captured in the final collapse of German forces in North Africa after weeks of fighting that everyone involved knew was already over. He had believed in the cause the way young men believe in things that arrive packaged as certainty, completely, without the structural doubt that only comes after the package has been opened and found to contain something different from what the label promised. The label had been very specific about America. America was soft, decadent, undisciplined, a country with money but no backbone, with soldiers who fought without conviction and people who had no understanding of real sacrifice. And its treatment of prisoners had been described in terms so specific and so consistent, repeated so many times by so many officers during training, that even the men who doubted other things had stopped doubting this. Emil had carried those lessons across France and through capture and onto the ship and for every mile of this train journey. He had held them the way you hold a known quantity in an unfamiliar situation, tightly, because certainty was the only thing that made the unfamiliar navigable. But every day on the ship had loosened his grip a little, and he had spent considerable effort tightening it again each time, because the alternative was a kind of freefall he was not ready for. He climbed into the back of one of the army trucks with the other prisoners. 43 men in total, all captured in North Africa during the final collapse of German forces there, all wearing the same stunned quiet of men who had spent too long expecting one thing and receiving another. The truck bed smelled of canvas and motor oil and the particular dry heat of a Wyoming afternoon that had no equivalent in any European climate he had experienced. Beside him sat Otto Keller, 46, a former railway clerk from Cologne, heavy-set and careful, a man who said little and observed everything, who had the look of someone who had been quietly correct about things his entire life and was not surprised to be quietly correct about this too. On Emil's other side sat Dieter Falk, 19, from Munich, who had volunteered for the Wehrmacht the week after his school graduation and still carried himself with the posture of someone who believed posture could substitute for understanding. Dieter leaned close as the truck moved forward and said quietly, "Maybe the real camp is farther on." Emil kept his eyes on the road and said, "Maybe," and did not believe it. The truck rolled along a dirt road for 15 minutes, passing a line of cottonwood trees near a dry creek bed, a cluster of ranch buildings in the far distance, and 2 hawks circling something invisible above a ridge to the west. The land was not hostile in the way that battlefields were hostile. It was simply enormous and completely without interest in the human beings moving through it. Emil found that more unsettling than hostility would have been, because hostility at least acknowledged your presence. Then the camp appeared, and he leaned forward instinctively, ready for the first sight of wire. He saw barracks, A mess hall with a screen door propped open, a medical building, an administration block, a flagpole with an American flag turning slowly in the wind. He saw everything except the one thing that made a prison a prison. No fence, no wire, no walls. Just a line of white painted posts in the distance, widely spaced, marking a boundary that was technically present and practically meaningless against a landscape that went on for 1,000 miles in every direction. Emil stared at those posts and felt the bottom drop out of the mental image he had been carrying since capture. Not because the posts were harmless, but because they were honest in a way he had not been prepared for. They were not pretending to hold anyone, and that was somehow worse. The truck stopped and the prisoners climbed down in silence. Most of them did exactly what Emil did. They looked outward first, toward the open land surrounding the camp, scanning for the thing that was supposed to be there. A fence said, "You are contained. We are in control. The power here is ours, and we are not ashamed to make it visible." This place said something else entirely, something Emil could feel but not yet name. An American lieutenant stood in the packed dirt in front of them, clipboard tucked under one arm, with the flat, unhurried manner of someone who had given this speech before and saw no reason to vary it. Beside him stood an army interpreter, older, wearing round glasses, with the slightly pained expression of a man who knew exactly how certain sentences were going to land and had learned to deliver them anyway. The lieutenant spoke, the interpreter followed, and together they moved through the standard arrival information. Prisoner of war status, Geneva Convention protections, camp rules, work assignment procedures, disciplinary consequences. Emil listened without moving. Everything was procedural, everything was reasonable, everything was delivered without visible contempt or visible satisfaction. That was already strange. He had expected the performance of power, the particular enjoyment that authority took in making its superiority visible. And what he was getting instead was administration, clean and impersonal and oddly respectful, like being processed by a system that had decided you were a person and was acting accordingly. Then the lieutenant said, "This camp operates without a full perimeter fence." The interpreter repeated it in German, and a murmur moved through the 43 men like a small current of electricity. Dieter made a short, disbelieving sound. Otto did not move at all, but something shifted very slightly in his face. "There are boundary markers," the lieutenant continued. "You do not cross them. Inside those limits, during designated hours, you may move freely through the campgrounds." He let the interpreter catch up, then delivered the last line with the same flat tone as everything before it, as though it were not remarkable. "If you want fresh air, take a walk." The silence that followed was the specific silence of men hearing something their categories cannot accommodate. Emil felt cold despite the afternoon sun on the back of his neck. This was theater, he told himself. This was a test designed to expose the foolish, to separate the men who could be baited from the men who could not. They were watching to see who would bolt, who would take the invitation at face value, who would walk toward those white posts and give them the excuse they were waiting for. He kept his hands still and his face still and waited for the mask to slip. Otto's hand went up slowly, and the lieutenant acknowledged him. Otto asked, in careful, measured German, where the outer barrier was. The real one. The one that actually held. The lieutenant looked at the land surrounding them, then back at the prisoners, with the expression of a man being asked about something so obvious he had to stop and consider how to explain it. "You're looking at it," he said, and let the interpreter finish, then pointed toward the nearest ridge line. "This is Wyoming. If you walk far enough in the wrong direction, the wilderness will handle the situation before we need to." A few guards near the truck smiled at that, not cruelly, not mockingly, but with the easy confidence of men who knew the land they were standing on and trusted it to do the work that wire would have done somewhere else. Emil stood with that information and tried to arrange it into a shape that made sense. He had expected walls. He had prepared himself psychologically for walls, for the specific humiliation of visible enclosure, for the pressure of a space designed to remind you constantly that you were contained. What he was looking at instead was the American version of the same thing, which was not walls at all, but distance, emptiness, weather, and the simple arithmetic of a man 1,000 miles from home with no route and no possibility. The cage was entirely real. It was simply invisible. And something about an invisible cage, he was discovering, was more unsettling than a visible one, because a visible cage at least had the dignity of honesty. They were walked to the barracks, and Emil entered his assigned building and stopped. He had constructed a careful mental image of what this room would look like, assembled from propaganda and from the logic of a system that regarded its prisoners as liabilities. Dirt floors, straw mattresses or bare boards, buckets, darkness, the visual language of punishment made permanent. What he found instead was a long, clean room with rows of cots, thin but real, each with a mattress that gave slightly under pressure, a stove at each end of the room, windows with actual glass, and shelves built into the wall for personal items. The floor was swept. The light came through clean panes. It smelled of pine lumber and the particular dry clarity of high-altitude desert air, which was not a pleasant smell exactly, but was a clean one, honest, without the rot and damp of a space designed to diminish the people inside it. Emil stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, because he needed to be sure he was seeing what he was seeing, and not what he expected to see. He chose a cot near the window and sat on it. The mattress gave slightly under his weight, and he had not sat on a mattress in 4 months, and he put his hands flat on it, and looked at the floor, and let his brain catch up to the day. Otto settled on the next cot, with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned long ago to take what was given without too much commentary. Dieter paced the length of the room once, twice, then sat down and put his face in his hands and was still. That first night was strange in the way all genuine disorientation is strange. Not dramatic, not loud, but deeply wrong in a quiet, persistent way, like a sound that is almost right but not quite, that you keep listening to because your brain will not stop trying to identify where the wrongness lives. Emil lay in the dark and listened to the camp outside. Wind moved across the dry grass with a sound that was neither friendly nor hostile, just present, continuous, ancient. Guards talked somewhere near the administration block, their voices low and indistinct, American English drifting in and out of comprehensibility through the thin wooden wall. Around him, the breathing of 40 men filled the room, all of them doing the same thing he was doing, lying still, listening, waiting for the threat to declare itself. It did not declare itself. That was the problem. The propaganda had been specific about the sequence: capture, then humiliation, then hard labor, then the gradual destruction of the person. He had been captured. He had been transported on a train with seats. He was lying on a real mattress in a room that had been swept. He reached up in the dark and touched the bar of soap on the shelf above his head. Real soap, pine-scented, solid and unambiguous, and held it for a moment before setting it back. From the next cot, Otto's voice came quietly through the darkness. "How far do you think it is to the nearest town?" Emil thought about the road and the emptiness. "Far enough to die trying," he said. "Then the fence is just honesty wearing a different face," Otto said, with the precise, unhurried certainty of a man who had been a railway clerk for 20 years and understood the difference between what a thing appeared to be and what it actually was. Emil stared at the ceiling and said nothing, because nothing was the only honest response, and honesty felt tonight like the only discipline worth keeping. The bell rang at 6 in the morning, and Emil was already awake. He had been awake since 4, lying in the gray, pre-dawn dark, listening to the wind move across the prairie outside the barracks wall. It was not anxiety that kept him awake exactly. It was something more like vigilance, the specific wakefulness of a man who had decided that the situation required constant monitoring and whose body had not yet received permission to stand down. He dressed in the dim light along with the other men, all of them moving with the careful economy of soldiers who had learned not to waste motion before they knew what the day required. Nobody spoke much. The silence had a texture to it, not the silence of men who had nothing to say, but the silence of men who were saving their observations until they had more data to work with. Outside, the morning air hit with a cold that surprised him. The day before had been warm, the afternoon sun bearing down on the parade ground with a weight that felt almost aggressive, and he had unconsciously assumed the nights would hold some of that warmth. Wyoming apparently operated on different terms. It gave you the sun when it chose and took the temperature back completely after dark, without negotiation. The guards directed them toward the mess hall with gestures and the occasional German word from the interpreter, who walked alongside the group with his hands in his pockets and the unhurried manner of a man doing a familiar job. Emil walked with Otto and Dieter, the three of them having arranged themselves into a loose unit the previous evening without discussing it, the way people in uncertain situations gravitate toward whatever feels like a fixed point. Dieter was still performing confidence, his chin up and his stride deliberate, but Emil could see the effort in it, the way you can see effort in any performance that is running slightly too long. The smell reached them before the building did. Emil stopped walking for a full second, his body reacting before his mind could process the information. A rich, layered smell of cooking meat and coffee and something baking, warm and specific and entirely real. Behind him, a man he didn't know by name made a low, involuntary sound that was not a word in any language, but was completely comprehensible. Bacon. It was bacon frying in large pans, the fat rendering and crisping and producing that particular smell that belonged to a world before rationing, before the long, systematic disappearance of everything ordinary. Emil had not smelled it in over a year. He stood in the doorway of the mess hall and breathed it in before he stepped forward, the way you pause at the entrance of something you want to be sure is real before you commit to entering it. Inside, long tables filled the room with the orderly abundance of a system that had planned for this number of people and prepared accordingly. American cooks in white aprons stood behind a serving counter with large pots and pans, moving with the brisk efficiency of people who had done this hundreds of times and would do it hundreds of times more. Steam rose from everything, from the pots, from the coffee urns, from the trays of food being kept warm under the bright overhead lights. A cook waved the prisoners forward and began putting food on their metal trays without ceremony or commentary. Scrambled eggs, hot and fresh, a full portion. 3 strips of bacon, actually crispy, not the soft gray substitute that German field rations had called bacon in the final months. 2 pieces of toast with a small square of real butter on the side, yellow and dense and smelling of actual cream. A cup of coffee. Emil lifted it and smelled it before he sat down, because the coffee in Germany had been made from roasted grain and chicory for so long that he needed to verify this was the real thing. It was. He stood there holding the cup for a moment longer than was necessary, and then carried his tray to a table and sat down and looked at everything in front of him with the careful attention of a man making an inventory. On the table, in a small white bowl, sat actual granulated sugar, white sugar, for coffee. He stared at it the way you stare at something you have been told does not exist. Around him, the other prisoners ate with the focused intensity of men who had forgotten that eating could be anything other than a management problem. Some ate quickly, as though speed might secure the supply before it could be withdrawn. Others ate with extreme slowness, the way Liesel had eaten on the ship, making each bite last, rationing pleasure the way they had learned to ration everything else. A few men had their eyes down and said nothing throughout the entire meal, and Emil recognized that silence as the silence of people doing something private, something that required the kind of concentration that conversation would interrupt. Nobody wept openly, but several men had the look of people who were managing something that wanted to be larger than the situation allowed. One older prisoner, Emil didn't know his name, a heavy man with a gray beard who had sat quietly on the train for 3 days, held his coffee cup in both hands and stared into it for a long time before he drank. Emil understood that completely. He ate his eggs and his bacon and his toast, and drank his coffee with the sugar dissolved in it, and tried to do it as an ordinary act, as a man eating breakfast, rather than a man being shown something. The food was too good for that. It insisted on being noticed. The eggs were seasoned properly. The bacon was hot all the way through. The butter had melted into the toast the way butter only melted when it was real and the bread was actually warm. He ate everything on his tray and sat for a moment afterward with his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, looking at the empty plates of the men around him. Later that morning, after they had been walked back to the barracks and issued camp clothing, practical, plain, clearly used but clean, a guard appeared in the doorway and made an announcement. The interpreter translated it into German. During the free period between morning duties and the midday meal, the prisoners were permitted to move within the camp boundaries without escort. They should stay inside the marked perimeter. They should not approach the administration building without reason. Otherwise, the morning was theirs. The guard left. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Dieter said, "That is the trick. That is where the shooting starts, when we step outside." He said it with the conviction of someone who needed the original theory to be correct, who had invested too much in it to receive new information gracefully. Otto looked at him from his cot with the mild, patient expression of a man who had spent 20 years working with schedules and understood that the schedule was the reality, not the expectation. If they wanted to shoot us, Otto said evenly, they had a much simpler opportunity at the train station. Emil put on the camp jacket they had issued him and went outside. He did it deliberately, without drama, because the only way to know what was true was to test it, and the only way to test it was to walk through the door. The morning air was cool and clear and smelled of the Wyoming prairie, and nobody shot him, and nobody followed him, and he stood on the packed dirt outside the barracks and looked at the open ground of the camp with the particular feeling of a man whose working hypothesis has just been revised. He walked slowly across the compound, following no particular route, allowing the geometry of the place to become familiar. The barracks were arranged in 2 rows, facing each other across a central ground. The mess hall anchored one end. The medical building and administration block sat at the other. Between them, in the wide-open middle, men moved, some in groups, some alone, all with the slightly uncertain gait of people who had been given a freedom they did not entirely trust yet and were testing its edges carefully. A guard stood near the administration building, watching, but not watching them specifically. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his face turned toward the hills in the distance. And the quality of his attention was the quality of a man doing his job rather than the quality of a man waiting for someone to make a mistake. Emil noted the difference. He had spent 3 years around guards and soldiers of various kinds, and he knew the difference between a man watching for trouble and a man watching for anything to happen. He walked to the edge of the central ground and stood looking toward the white posts that marked the boundary. From here, he could see 3 of them, spaced perhaps 50 meters apart, standing in the dry grass at a distance he estimated to be about 200 meters. Beyond them, the land continued without interruption. Scrub, low sage, the beginning of a slope that rose toward a ridge line perhaps 3 kilometers out. He stood there for a while, looking at the posts and at the land beyond them, and felt the invisible cage arrange itself more precisely around him. It was made of distance and emptiness and the honest impossibility of the arithmetic. He could feel its walls more clearly in a way than he had ever felt barbed wire. That afternoon, a guard named Corporal Walsh came to the barracks. He was perhaps 30, with red hair and the practical directness of a man who disliked wasted conversation. He spoke through the interpreter, addressing the group assembled on their cots. The camp commander had authorized work details on local farms beginning the following week. It was voluntary. Men who chose to work would receive 50 cents per day, deposited into accounts held in Geneva. They would be transported by truck, supervised by armed guard, and returned to camp by evening. Dieter's head came up immediately. "And if we refuse?" he asked. The interpreter relayed it. Corporal Walsh looked at Dieter with the mild expression of a man who had answered this question before and found it slightly tedious. "Then you stay in camp," he said. "Your choice." He said it without sarcasm, without the edge of authority demonstrating its patience for the benefit of the room. He said it as a statement of fact, the way you state a fact that has no emotional content for you personally, and then he moved on to the next item of business. That evening at dinner, soup with actual meat in it, bread, canned fruit, more coffee. Emil sat with Otto, and they talked quietly about the work details. Otto wanted to go, not from enthusiasm but from the practical instinct of a man who understood that idleness compounded uncertainty. "Doing something is always better than waiting for something," Otto said, breaking a piece of bread with his large, careful hands. "Waiting makes everything larger. Work makes things their actual size." Emil agreed, though he could not have said exactly why, and they put their names on the list that Corporal Walsh left at the door of the barracks. That night, Emil lay in his cot and wrote a letter to his mother in Dresden. The letter would be read by censors before it was sent, which meant the truth he could offer was limited. He could not describe the camp accurately, could not describe the food accurately, could not say anything that might be read as an assessment of American military capability. He could say he was alive. He could say he was housed and fed. He could say he was not hurt. He wrote all of that in careful measured sentences, trying to make them say more than their words technically contained. The way you speak around a thing you cannot name directly, but need the listener to understand. His mother was in Dresden, which was being bombed. He did not know if she was reading his letters. He did not know if she was still alive to read them. He wrote anyway because writing was the only form of contact available, and the only alternative to writing was silence, and silence in the direction of Dresden felt like giving something up that he was not yet ready to give up. He folded the letter and addressed it and put it on the shelf above his cot and looked at the ceiling. Through the window, the Wyoming sky was enormous and black and scattered with more stars than he had ever seen in Germany, where the light of cities had always softened the dark. Out here, the dark was complete and the stars were specific, each one sharp and present, and he lay looking at them for a long time before he understood what was wrong with the view. Nothing was on fire. Nowhere in that sky was there the glow of burning things that meant a city was being destroyed. The sky was simply dark, and the stars were simply stars, and that absence, the absence of fire, was the most disorienting thing he had encountered since arriving, because he had forgotten that a night sky could look like that. He pulled his blanket up and closed his eyes and thought about 50 cents a day and a Wyoming farm and what it meant to be trusted with work by a country that did not need to give you its trust and had given it anyway. He did not arrive at a conclusion. But the question itself was new, and new questions were. He was slowly learning. the first sign that the old answers were no longer sufficient. The farm was called the Henderson Place, and it sat 12 miles outside camp on a dirt road that wound through low hills and dry creek beds before opening onto a flat stretch of irrigated land that looked, in the early morning light, almost impossibly green against the surrounding brown. Emil saw it through the truck window and felt something register in his chest that was not quite recognition and not quite longing, but lived somewhere between the two. It reminded him of the agricultural land east of Dresden, not in its specific geography but in its quality of productivity. The particular look of land that had been worked carefully for generations and showed it. 6 prisoners had volunteered for the first work detail. Corporal Walsh rode in the front of the truck with the driver, and a second guard named Private Stokes sat in the back with the prisoners, young, perhaps 20, with the patient, bored expression of someone assigned to a task he found neither interesting nor objectionable. He did not watch the prisoners the way a man watches people he expects to cause trouble. He watched them the way a man watches the road on a long drive, which was to say he was technically watching, but his attention was elsewhere, occupied by something internal that had nothing to do with the men around him. Emil sat beside Otto and observed all of this carefully. He had been observing everything carefully since the train platform, assembling a picture of the Americans from detail rather than from theory, because theory had already failed him thoroughly, and detail was all he had left. The truck stopped at the Henderson farmhouse and a man came out to meet them. He was perhaps 55, lean and weathered, with the particular economy of movement that came from a lifetime of physical work in a dry climate. He shook Corporal Walsh's hand, looked the 6 prisoners over without visible concern, and said something in English that the interpreter rendered as, "I need the east field cleared and the irrigation channels checked. Should take most of the day. They look like they know what work is." His name was Robert Henderson, and he ran the farm alone since his 2 sons had gone overseas with the army, one in the Pacific, one in Italy. He said this to the interpreter without apparent expectation of sympathy, as a simple statement of current conditions, the way a farmer describes the state of his equipment or the status of his water rights. Emil received the information and noted it. This man's sons were fighting against countries like the one Emil had been fighting for. That arithmetic was present in the morning air between them, acknowledged by neither side, and set aside in favor of the work. Henderson handed out tools from the barn, shovels, hose, a long-handled rake, and pointed toward the east field with the directness of a man who trusted that instructions given clearly would be followed correctly. He spoke to the interpreter for a moment, and the interpreter relayed the instructions to the prisoners, and then Henderson walked back to the farmhouse to begin his own morning and left them to it. No one stood over them. No one watched to make sure they were working rather than planning something. They were simply on a farm with tools, and the field needed doing. Emil worked steadily through the morning, clearing the dried growth from the irrigation channels with the focused physical attention that good outdoor work required. The sun came up properly as they worked, burning off the cool of the early morning and replacing it with the dry, insistent heat of a Wyoming summer day that had no interest in moderation. Sweat soaked through his work shirt by 9 o'clock. His hands found their rhythm, and his mind found the particular quiet that physical labor produced. Not blankness, but a narrowing of focus to the immediate task that was its own kind of relief. Otto worked nearby, methodical as expected, moving along the channel with the steady pace of a man who understood the difference between working hard and working efficiently. He did not rush and he did not slow, and by mid-morning his section of the channel was notably cleaner than anyone else's, accomplished with the same level of visible effort. Emil watched him and thought about what 20 years of railway scheduling did to a man's relationship with time and sequence, and concluded that it apparently produced something genuinely useful. Dieter had come on the detail despite his stated suspicion of it, apparently deciding that outdoor work was preferable to another day of sitting in the barracks testing the theory that captivity might improve through the application of defiant stillness. He worked alongside a man named Carl, who was 32 and had been a carpenter before the war, and the two of them moved through their section of the field with the competitive efficiency of men who had decided without discussing it that the other's pace was a personal challenge. At midday, Henderson came back out of the farmhouse carrying a large basket and called them in from the field. They gathered under the shade of a cottonwood tree near the barn, and Henderson's wife, a small, direct woman named Ruth who moved with the decisive efficiency of someone perpetually managing more tasks than the hours contained, came out behind him carrying a pitcher of cold lemonade and a stack of tin cups. She set them down on the wooden table without ceremony and poured without being asked, filling each cup to the top, and did not wait to be thanked before going back inside. The basket contained sandwiches wrapped in cloth. Thick slices of bread with ham and cheese and a mustard that tasted different from German mustard, sharper and brighter and entirely real. There were also hard-boiled eggs, a handful each, and oatmeal cookies in a paper bag that Henderson set in the middle of the table and gestured toward without making it a significant act. Emil unwrapped his sandwich and took a bite and sat with the taste of it for a moment before he continued eating. Real bread, real meat, real cheese, the flavors of things made from complete ingredients by people who had not needed to substitute or stretch or calculate. The lemonade was cold in a way he had not experienced in years. Cold from an actual icebox, sweet and tart, and when he drank it, the cold moved down through him and the heat of the morning became briefly manageable. He looked at the cup in his hand and thought about the water in North Africa, metallic and warm, rationed and never enough, and set the thought aside because it led somewhere he did not have the energy for in the middle of a working day. After lunch, Henderson disappeared into the barn and came out 10 minutes later carrying a shotgun broken open over his forearm. He walked toward the group with the purposeful ease of a man carrying a familiar tool on familiar ground. He spoke to the interpreter for a moment, and the interpreter turned to the prisoners with the expression he wore when he was translating something he anticipated would require a moment to land. He says there are ground squirrels in the south field damaging the root crops. He wants to know if one of you is a good enough shot to clear some of them out this afternoon. He paused. He's offering to lend the gun. Nobody moved for a moment. Emil was aware of the weight of the sentence. A shotgun offered by an American farmer to a German prisoner of war on a farm 12 miles from camp, on an unremarkable Wednesday afternoon in Wyoming. He was aware of every component of that sentence individually and of the extraordinary collision of them together. He looked at Henderson, who was standing with the gun resting in the crook of his arm and his hat pushed back on his head and no particular expression on his face. Because to Henderson this was a practical problem that required a practical solution, and the nationality of the solution was irrelevant. Carl raised his hand. He had been a hunter before the war, he said, in the forests outside Nuremberg. The interpreter relayed this. Henderson looked at him for a moment, not assessing his trustworthiness exactly, or at least not visibly, but with the frank evaluative look of a man deciding whether someone could do a job, and then handed him the gun and a box of shells. Carl took both with the careful hands of someone who respected firearms and knew how to hold one. Henderson showed him the south field with a gesture, said something brief, and went back to his own work. Carl walked toward the south field with the gun under his arm and the shells in his jacket pocket. Emil watched him go and felt something he did not immediately have a name for. Not envy, not fear, not the theoretical ideological response that he would have been expected to have 6 months ago. It was something more like awe at the specificity of the moment, at the fact that this precise configuration of circumstances was occurring on an actual afternoon in an actual place and would be part of what had happened, irrevocably, in the record of things that had been true. An American farmer had handed a German prisoner a loaded gun and gone back to work. For the next 2 hours, the sound of the shotgun came intermittently from the south field, and the ground squirrel population of the Henderson farm declined, and nobody was shot who was not a ground squirrel. At the end of the afternoon, Carl brought the gun back with the remaining shells and set them on the table outside the barn with the same careful hands he had used to receive them. Henderson counted the shells, nodded, said something that the interpreter translated as good work, and put the gun away. On the truck back to camp, nobody spoke for the first several miles. The evening light was doing something extraordinary to the Wyoming landscape, turning the dry grass gold and the low hills purple, and the sky above them a shade of orange that had no precise name in either German or English. Emil sat with his back against the truck wall and his hands on his knees, and looked at the light and let the day arrange itself inside him. Otto broke the silence eventually, as Otto usually did, not with drama, not with the forced significance of a man who had been saving a pronouncement, but with the plain observation of someone who had been thinking something through and had arrived at the end of the process. He gave Carl a gun, Otto said. He didn't think about it for long. He just decided Carl could be trusted with it and gave it to him. He paused, watching the hills go by. In Germany, that kind of trust travels through ranks and forms and approvals and the whole structure of authority deciding whether you deserve it. Here, a farmer just looked at a man and made up his own mind. Emil considered that for a long time without answering. He thought about the forms and the ranks and the structure of authority, and he thought about Henderson standing with the gun in his arm and the hat pushed back on his head, making a simple practical judgment about a man he had known for 4 hours. He thought about what it meant to live in a system where that kind of judgment was yours to make, where the decision about who was trustworthy belonged to the individual rather than to the apparatus above him. He had no framework for it yet that felt complete. But the absence of a complete framework did not mean the thing itself was absent. And what Henderson had done that afternoon was real, and it had happened, and he was going to have to think about what it meant for a long time before he understood it fully. Dinner that evening was chicken with roasted potatoes and green beans and fresh bread and canned peaches for dessert, served with the same matter-of-fact abundance that every meal at the camp was served with, as though 3,000 calories a day were simply what people required, and providing it was unremarkable. Emil ate steadily and listened to the men around him talk about the farm, about the shotgun, about Ruth Henderson's lemonade and the sandwiches and the oatmeal cookies. The conversation had a quality he had not heard in the barracks before. Not hope exactly, but something adjacent to it. The particular animation of men who have had a day that gave them something real to talk about. Dieter sat at the far end of the table and ate without contributing to the conversation. He was not sulking. His face was too still for sulking, which was an active performance. He was thinking, which was a different thing entirely, and Emil recognized it because he had been doing the same thing in various forms since the train platform. The theory Dieter had brought to this place was meeting the evidence of this place, and the collision was producing something that had not resolved itself yet. Emil understood that process intimately. He gave it time because time was the only thing that actually helped, and everything else was just noise around the edges. That night he lay on his cot and thought about the Henderson farm and the shotgun and the lemonade and the 50 cents being deposited somewhere in Geneva that he would be able to access after a war that he was increasingly certain Germany was not going to win. He thought about his mother in Dresden and whether her window was intact and whether she was eating. He thought about Otto's observation on the truck, about trust traveling through ranks and forms in Germany and through a man's own judgment in Wyoming. And he turned it over and looked at it from several angles and still could not find the edge of it, the place where it stopped being true. Outside, the prairie wind moved through the grass and the stars were out again in their improbable abundance, and the sky above Wyoming was dark and clear and entirely without fire, and Emil Hartmann lay in the dark and felt something inside him that had been rigid for 3 years begin, very slowly and without his permission, to consider the possibility of bending. October arrived without announcing itself. The way seasons arrived in Wyoming, not gradually but suddenly, overnight, as though the land had made a decision and implemented it without consultation. Emil woke one morning to find the grass outside the barracks window had gone from dry gold to something harder and paler, and the air coming under the door carried a cold with an edge to it that the September mornings had not had. He lay still for a moment and listened to the wind and thought about Dresden in October, about the smell of coal fires starting up in the apartment buildings, about his mother making the soup she made every year when the cold came back, and then he got up and dressed because lying still with those thoughts was a form of self-destruction he had decided to resist. The work details had continued through September and into October, and Emil had been on 12 of them now, the Henderson farm twice more, and 3 other farms in the valley, and twice to a grain storage facility outside the nearest town, where the work was heavy and repetitive, and the foreman was a taciturn man named Delaney, who communicated almost entirely through gesture and who treated the German prisoners with the same brusque indifference he apparently directed at everyone, which was its own form of equality. He had learned the names of things in English, tools, crops, the parts of machinery, the words for weather conditions. He practiced them in his head during the truck rides, assembling a language piece by piece the way you assemble anything structural, starting with the load-bearing elements and working outward. Otto had taken to English with the systematic thoroughness of a man who had spent 2 decades managing complex timetables and understood that any system worth understanding was worth learning from the inside. He borrowed an English grammar from the camp library, a small room in the recreation building with 2 shelves of donated books, several decks of cards, a chess set missing 2 pieces, and a piano that a prisoner named Werner played every evening with a quiet competence that filled the common area with something that had no business being as comforting as it was. Otto studied the grammar with the same careful attention he had given his railway schedules and was already constructing sentences that were grammatically correct if slightly formal, like a building that had been engineered precisely but not yet lived in. Letters from home arrived irregularly, in batches, held up by the censorship process and the general disorder of a postal system operating across the geography of a world war. Emil received 3 letters in October, all written weeks or months before, all carrying the particular combination of information and omission that characterized correspondence written under wartime conditions by someone who understood that a censor was reading over their shoulder. His mother's handwriting had always been precise and even. School teacher's handwriting, the kind that expressed care through its consistency. In these letters, the handwriting was still precise, but the pressure of the pen was harder, as if the effort of maintaining the appearance of normalcy required physical force. She wrote about the neighborhood, about the families still on their street, about the small transactions of daily life, who had gotten what on their ration card, whose garden had produced well despite everything, which shops were still open. She did not write about the bombing directly, but she described the nights in terms that made the nights comprehensible. Going to bed early, sleeping lightly, the particular quality of quiet after a loud night. She did not write about food except in the administrative terms of ration cards and queue lengths, never in terms of hunger or satisfaction, because the line between those two things had apparently ceased to be meaningful. Emil read the letters 3 times each and then put them on the shelf above his cot, where he could see them without having to pick them up. He thought about the mess hall 3 buildings away, where dinner that evening would be pot roast with carrots and potatoes, bread, coffee, canned fruit, the same abundance that had been delivered 3 times a day without interruption since his arrival. He thought about his mother's ration card and the queue lengths she described in her careful measured sentences, and the arithmetic between those 2 sets of facts was not comfortable arithmetic, and he did not try to make it comfortable. He simply held it because the truth of a thing did not become less true because it was uncomfortable to hold. The emotional geography of the barracks had shifted over the weeks since arrival, sorting itself into configurations that were becoming stable. A group of 8 men, Dieter among them, maintained the original theory with diminishing conviction but undiminished volume. America's kindness was strategic, the food was a weapon, the trust was a trap, and the man who allowed himself to be affected by it was a man who had failed his country and his duty. They made this argument with the particular intensity of people who understood, at some level, that intensity was doing the work that evidence was no longer able to do. A larger group, 20 or so, Emil and Otto among them, had moved into a quieter place that was not surrender and was not conversion, but was something more like honest suspension. They had stopped arguing with the evidence and started simply receiving it day by day, without forcing it into the old containers that no longer fit. They ate the food and did the work and wrote letters home and played cards in the evenings and listened to Werner play the piano and let the accumulation of days do what accumulation did, which was to change the shape of a person, whether the person had consented to be changed or not. The remaining men occupied various positions between these 2 poles, moving back and forth depending on what the day had brought them. A good letter from home that made the distance feel survivable, or a bad one that made the comparison between home and here feel like a judgment they had not asked to receive. Emil watched all of them with the careful attention he had been paying to everything since the train platform, noting the variations, trying to understand the mechanism by which a man's certainty either held or gave way. He was aware that he was also watching himself, and that the watching was its own kind of evidence. The Christmas announcement came in early December, posted on the board outside the administration building on a gray morning when the first real snow was falling across the camp in thin diagonal lines. Emil read it twice, standing in the cold with his hands in his pockets. The camp commander had authorized a Christmas dinner on the 24th. The town's civilian community had been invited to participate. Attendance was not required but encouraged. There would be food and there would be guests, and the details beyond that were not specified. Dieter read it over Emil's shoulder and said immediately that it was propaganda, a show put on for a purpose that would reveal itself in time. He said it with less force than he would have said the same thing in September, the way a man repeats a position he has been defending for so long that the defending has become more important than the position itself. Emil said nothing in response, because engaging with Dieter's theory required treating it as a theory worthy of engagement, and he was no longer sure it was. Otto read the announcement last and said only that he would attend, and that he intended to eat whatever was served, and that if that made him a propaganda casualty, then he would accept the designation with equanimity. He said it in his flat railway clerk's voice, without humor or irony, as a straightforward statement of intent, and then he went to put his name on the attendance list, and Emil followed him. December 24th arrived with a cold that had grown serious over the preceding weeks. The Wyoming winter establishing itself without apology, temperatures dropping below 0 at night and not recovering much during the days. The barrack stoves ran continuously, and the men had received additional blankets and heavier coats from the camp stores, issued with the same impersonal efficiency as everything else. Emil lay in his warm bunk on the morning of the 24th and thought about his mother in her cold apartment, with its boarded-up windows and its furniture burned for heat. And then he got up and put on the warmest clothes he had and went to breakfast. The mess hall had been decorated. Someone had strung paper chains in red and green along the walls and across the ceiling, and a small pine tree had appeared in the corner overnight, set in a bucket of sand with candles clipped to its branches. The cooks were doing something different this morning. The smell of the food was different, more complex, and the guards were moving with a slight elevation of energy that Emil had not seen before. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it in. The paper chains and the pine tree and the particular quality of a room where something is being prepared with deliberate care, and felt something move in his chest that he did not try to name. The day was ordinary in its surface structure. Morning work assignments, midday meal, afternoon free period. But underneath the ordinary surface ran a current of anticipation that everyone in the camp felt, regardless of which theory they subscribed to, because anticipation was not ideological, and bodies did not check credentials before responding to the smell of something being prepared. Even Dieter was quieter than usual by afternoon, his defenses lowered slightly by the sheer animal fact of warmth and food, and a pine tree in a corner with candles on it. At 6 in the evening, guards came to the barracks and told them it was time. Emil walked through the snow with Otto and 200 other prisoners, their breath making clouds in the frozen air, the camp lights warm and yellow against the dark. The snow had stopped falling an hour ago, and the sky above them was clearing, stars appearing at the edges first and then spreading across the black in their improbable Wyoming abundance. His boots made prints in the fresh snow, and he could hear the boots of the men around him doing the same, 200 sets of footsteps in the cold, and the sound of it was oddly moving in a way he could not have explained. When he opened the door to the mess hall, the warmth hit him first, a solid wall of warm air coming from the stoves and the bodies and the food that stopped him for a half-second on the threshold. Then the smell arrived and was, like the smell of bacon on his first morning, more than a smell. It was a summoning, a direct line to specific rooms and specific times that no longer existed in the forms he remembered. Roasting meat, baked bread, cinnamon, the faint sweetness of something made with real sugar, pine from the tree in the corner where the candles were lit now and their light moved and flickered across the walls. He stood in the doorway and breathed it in and let it be what it was. The tables were different tonight. White cloths had been laid over them. Actual tablecloths, pressed and clean. Real plates sat at each place instead of the metal trays they used every other day. There were glasses for drinks and folded paper napkins, and in the center of each table a small candle in a holder, its flame steady in the still warm air. The Christmas tree in the corner had more candles on it now, a dozen of them, their light dancing together and casting the whole room in something warmer and more human than the overhead lights that served every ordinary evening. Then the food came out, and the room went very quiet. American cooks brought platters to the tables, roasted turkey, golden brown and steaming, the smell of it filling the room completely and immediately. Glazed ham with a sweet dark crust. Mashed potatoes with butter melting in pools across the surface. Roasted carrots and green beans. Bread rolls fresh from the oven, their crusts crackling softly as they cooled. Cranberry sauce in small bowls, dark red and trembling. Gravy in pitchers. More food than Emil had seen on a single table since before the war. More food than he had seen assembled for any purpose other than a pre-war celebration of some significance. He sat down and looked at his plate and tried to locate the correct response to it, and could not, because the correct response exceeded the available categories. This was not the impersonal abundance of the daily meals, which he had learned to receive with a kind of managed gratitude. This was food prepared with intention, with care, for a purpose, for an occasion. Someone had decided that these men deserved a Christmas dinner and had made one. Someone had decided that the word enemy did not cancel the word human, and had acted on that decision with roasted turkey and glazed ham, and bread rolls still hot from the oven. He ate slowly, methodically, the way you eat something you want to remain present for. The turkey was perfect, juicy and seasoned and tender, the skin crisp to a golden brown that took skill and attention to achieve. The potatoes were smooth and rich, the butter real, the gravy deep and dark and made from actual pan drippings. The bread was soft inside with a crust that broke properly. He ate everything, and then sat for a moment with his hands in his lap and looked at the empty plate and the guttered remains of the candle, and felt the full weight of the meal. Not just the food, but what the food represented. What it said about the people who had made it, and the judgment they had made about who deserved it. The door opened at 8 and cold air moved through the room. A group of civilians came in from the town, men and women and a few children, in their winter coats, carrying bags and boxes, their faces bright from the cold outside and from something else, something warmer than cold could account for. Emil tensed without meaning to, the old reflex of a man trained to read civilian presence in a military context as a variable requiring assessment. But they were smiling, genuinely and without performance. The smiles of people who had come somewhere they wanted to come for a reason they believed in. They moved through the room handing out small gifts. Emil received a bar of chocolate, a pair of wool socks, a small book of English phrases with German translations penciled in the margins by someone who had done this before. An older woman with white hair and the deliberate, careful movement of someone who had decided long ago to be gentle in all her dealings stopped in front of Otto and handed him a package. Inside was a pair of wool gloves, dark green, hand-knitted, the stitches tight and even and warm. Otto looked at them for a long time without speaking. The woman said, "Merry Christmas" in English and then, carefully, in German, "Frohe Weihnachten." She had learned it, or remembered it, from grandparents perhaps, from parents, from the same German heritage that ran through this town like a river underground. Otto looked up at her and said thank you in both languages, and she put her hand briefly on his arm and moved on. Emil watched that exchange from 3 feet away and felt something give way inside him that he had been holding in place for a long time. Not dramatically. There was no single moment of collapse, no theatrical breaking point. It was quieter than that. It was the specific, private surrender of a man who has been holding a position against accumulating evidence for too long and has finally, on a December evening in Wyoming with the smell of roasted turkey in the air and a woman offering wool gloves to his friend in 2 languages, run out of the energy required to keep holding it. Someone began to sing. A prisoner named Heinrich, who had a strong, clear baritone that Emil had heard through the barracks wall some evenings, started the first notes of Stille Nacht, Silent Night, in German, quietly at first, as if offering it rather than performing it. Other voices joined, one by one, adding themselves to the song the way people add themselves to something true, not because they have decided to, but because the truth of it creates a gravitational pull that is stronger than the decision to resist. Emil sang. His voice cracked on the first phrase and steadied on the second, and he sang the rest of it without stopping. Then, from across the room, an American voice joined in. Then another. Then the civilians who had come from town, some in English, some in a German that was 3rd generation, and imperfect, and entirely sincere. 2 languages in the same melody, the same notes carrying different words that meant the same thing. The same hope, the same appeal to something larger than the categories that divided the people singing it. Emil stood and sang and looked around the room, at the German prisoners with full plates and wet eyes, at the American guards with their faces open and unguarded in a way that duty usually prevented, at the civilians who had come across town on a cold night to give wool gloves to enemy soldiers because it was Christmas, and that was what you did. He thought about the propaganda. He thought about the speeches and the posters and the careful architecture of the story he had been given about who America was and what it wanted and what it would do. He thought about every piece of that story and set it against the room he was standing in. The food, the candles, the gifts. The woman who had learned 2 words of German to say on this one night. The guards singing in a language that was not theirs about a night that belonged to everyone. The story and the room could not both be true. One of them was what he had been told. One of them was what was happening. He was standing inside one of them, eating its food, wearing its socks, hearing its music in his own language, and the choice between them was not actually a choice at all. He went back to the barracks that night through the snow, the cold clean and absolute after the warmth of the mess hall. He walked slowly, not hurrying, letting the cold work on his face. The stars were out in full now, the sky completely clear, and the snow on the ground caught their light and held it, and the camp was quiet except for the sound of boots and the wind. He stopped once on the path between the mess hall and the barracks, and stood still and looked up at the sky and breathed. In his hands he held the chocolate bar and the socks and the English phrasebook with its penciled German translations. They were small things, objectively. A bar of chocolate, a pair of socks, a second-hand book with another person's handwriting in the margins. They were not significant objects by any measure that the world he had grown up in would have applied, but they had been given to him by people who had no reason to give him anything, people whose country he had been trying to defeat, whose sons were fighting his country's soldiers on the other side of an ocean, and they had given them anyway, with smiles that were not performances, with a woman saying Frohe Weihnachten in careful, imperfect German on a cold December night because she had decided, or simply known without deciding, that it was the right thing to say. He stood in the snow and held that truth until he was sure he had it completely, until it was fully inside him rather than just passing through. Then he walked back to the barracks and sat on his cot and looked at the objects in his hands and wrote 3 sentences in the margin of the English phrasebook, in German, in his own handwriting, Below the anonymous penciled translations, he wrote, "A country strong enough to be kind, an enemy treated as a person, a fence made of trust instead of wire." He looked at the sentences for a long time, then closed the book and put it on the shelf and lay down and pulled his blanket up. Outside, the Wyoming winter moved across the prairie in the dark, and the stars were enormous and the sky was clear, and Emil Hartmann lay in his warm bunk and let the crack that had been opening in him since the train platform finally split all the way through. Quietly, completely, and without going back. The war ended in May of 1945, and the news arrived at the camp on a Tuesday morning, delivered by the same administrative efficiency that had delivered everything else. A notice posted on the board outside the administration building, formal and brief, stating that Germany had surrendered unconditionally and that processing for repatriation would begin in the coming months. Emil read it standing in the early morning light with his hands in the pockets of his camp jacket, the same jacket he had worn since October, now soft and worn at the elbows from a year and a half of daily use. He had known it was coming. The letters from home had been describing the approach of the end for months, each one more compressed than the last, the sentences getting shorter as the situation got larger. His mother's schoolteacher handwriting maintaining its precision while everything around it collapsed. He stood at the board for a long time after reading it, not because the notice required more reading, but because he needed a moment before the day continued. The war he had been fighting when he was captured was over. The country he had been fighting for had been defeated completely, divided, occupied, reduced from the master race building a new world order to a bombed-out collection of ruined cities administered to question whether the ground beneath them would hold. He watched it without resentment now, without the complicated envy that had complicated the earlier journey. He watched it with something more like honest appreciation, the appreciation of a man who had been shown what was possible and intended to carry the knowledge of it back to a place where it was needed. The ship left from New York Harbor on a gray November morning, the city's skyline visible and whole behind them as they moved out into the Atlantic. Emil stood on the deck with Otto and watched the harbor recede until the skyline was a line and then a suggestion, and then gone, replaced by the gray water and the gray sky and the particular solitude of the open ocean. Other men stood along the rail doing the same thing, watching America disappear, each of them carrying whatever 18 months in Wyoming had done to them. Whatever the food and the trust and the work details and the Christmas dinner and the absence of fences had deposited inside them that they would carry back to Germany, whether they intended to or not. The crossing took 10 days. Emil spent them reading and writing and practicing his English with the interpreter, who was making the return journey and who had developed over the previous months into something approaching a friend, a man named Joseph Stern, born in Cincinnati to German parents, who spoke both languages with equal fluency, and inhabited both with the ease of someone who had long since stopped experiencing them as contradictory. Stern told him things about America that the camp had not shown him, its contradictions, its inequalities, the gap between its principles and its practice. He told him honestly and without defensiveness, the way a person who loves something honestly describes its flaws, and Emil received it the same way, because a country that could be honestly described by its own people was a country that had something the country he was returning to had tried to make illegal. The ship docked in Hamburg in late November, and Emil walked down the ramp and stepped onto German soil and stopped. The smell was the first thing. Smoke and cold and the particular dusty mineral smell of pulverized brick that he recognized from his mother's letters. The smell of a city that had been hit hard and repeatedly, and was still in the early stages of understanding what it was now that it was no longer what it had been. He stood at the bottom of the ramp and breathed it in and let it be real, because he had been preparing for this moment for months and had decided that the correct approach was not to brace against it, but to receive it fully, whatever it was. Hamburg was a graveyard wearing the face of a city. Buildings stood in various states of ruin along streets that had been partially cleared, the rubble pushed to the sides to allow movement, the gaps where whole buildings had been opening onto sky that was not supposed to be visible from those angles. People moved through the streets with the compressed efficiency of people managing the gap between what life required and what the circumstances permitted. They were thin, most of them, with the particular thinness that came from sustained inadequacy rather than temporary shortage, the thinness that had become the body's normal operating condition. Emil walked through it and looked at everything and did not look away. He found his mother on the third day. She was living with her sister in a partially repaired apartment in a neighborhood that had survived better than most. Though better than most in Hamburg in 1945 still meant 2 of the building's 4 floors were uninhabitable, and the windows on the north side were covered with boards. She opened the door and saw him, and made a sound that was not a word in any language, and put her hands on his face and held them there for a long moment before she let him in. She had aged in the way that people aged who had been living at the far edge of what the body could manage for years. Not gradually, but all at once, the gap between the person he remembered and the person in the doorway representing not 4 years, but something that had no number. She looked at him the same way Mrs. Bauer had looked at Liesel in the other story, the way everyone who had stayed looked at everyone who had been captured, with the specific bewilderment of people seeing health standing in the middle of a context where health was not supposed to be possible. "You're so well," she kept saying, touching his face, his arms, the fabric of his jacket, verifying him through contact. "Look at you. You look so well." He was 40 pounds heavier than she was. He had color in his face. His hands were not shaking. He had slept properly for 18 months on a real mattress under real blankets in a heated room, and eaten 3 real meals every day, and his body showed it in every particular, and her body showed the other side of that arithmetic in every particular, and the distance between them was a fact he had been carrying since his mother's first letters, and was now standing inside in a doorway in Hamburg in November. She made tea from dried herbs. Real tea had been gone for years, and she did not apologize for its absence or explain it, because it required neither apology nor explanation. It simply was. She put a piece of bread on a plate and set it in front of him, and said it was half her ration, and he should eat it. He looked at the bread, dark and hard, small, exactly as she had described in her letters, and thought about the mess hall 3 buildings from his barracks in Wyoming, about pot roast and carrots and fresh bread and canned peaches, about 3,000 calories a day delivered without ceremony, as though abundance were simply the baseline expectation of a functioning country. He pushed the bread back toward her. She pushed it back to him. They divided it, neither half enough, both halves shared, which was the only thing to do with a thing that was not enough. People asked him about the camp in the weeks that followed, because word had spread that he had been in America for a year and a half and returned looking like a man who had not been in a war. He told them what he had seen. He told them about the open land and the white posts, and the guard who had told them they could take a walk. He told them about the breakfast on the first morning, and the Henderson farm and the shotgun handed to Carl across a farm table by a man who had made his own judgment about who could be trusted with it. He told them about the Christmas dinner and the woman who had said Frohe Weihnachten in careful, imperfect German because she had decided it was the right thing to say. Some listened with the hungry attention of people receiving information about a world they had never been able to imagine clearly. Some listened with the bitter distance of people who had stayed and suffered and found the story of humane captivity difficult to place alongside their own experience. One man told him flatly that it was impossible, that the Americans were the same as anyone else, that kindness at that scale was always a performance concealing something. Emil looked at this man, thin, cold-eyed, rigid with the specific rigidity of someone who had suffered and decided that the suffering was the truth of the world, and felt something that was not contempt and was not pity, but was the recognition of a man who had held the same position and understood what it cost to hold it and what it cost to let it go. He said, "I ate their food for 18 months. I slept in their beds. I worked on their farms, and they handed me tools and trusted me with the work. And at Christmas, a woman knitted me socks, because it was the right thing to do. I know what I saw. I know what was real. You can decide it was a performance, but a performance that runs for 18 months without breaking is not a performance. It is just the truth wearing its own face." He found work eventually in the rebuilding. Physical labor furbied. Reduced from the master race building a new world order to a bombed-out collection of ruined cities administered by the armies of the countries it had tried to destroy. That was the word for it. Reduced. Everything that the propaganda had promised and the cause had demanded and the war had been for had been reduced to rubble and ration cards and the specific silence of a country that had run out of things to say in its own defense. Otto appeared beside him and read the notice and said nothing for a moment. Then he said in the quiet, precise voice he used for all his most accurate observations, "We lost before we got here. We just didn't know it yet." He turned and walked back toward the barracks, and Emil watched him go, and thought about the train window and the factories and the rivers and the sky over Wyoming on the first afternoon, and understood that Otto was right in the specific way that Otto was always right, not with the pleasure of being right, but with the simple accuracy of a man who had been paying attention. The months between the announcement and the actual departure moved with the strange, elongated quality of time in transition. Days that were ordinary on their surface but carried underneath them the weight of impending change, the way the air changed before a storm that had not yet arrived. Emil continued to work, continued to eat 3 meals a day, continued to write letters to his mother in Dresden, whose responses came back in batches, each one a little more detailed than the last as the censorship requirements loosened with the end of active conflict. She was alive. The apartment was damaged but standing. The neighborhood was occupied by Soviet forces, which she described in the careful understatement of a woman who understood that some facts conveyed themselves sufficiently without elaboration. He used the remaining months with the intentionality of someone who understood that he was leaving a situation that had given him things he needed to account for before it ended. He studied English seriously, working through the grammar book and the phrase book and the donated novels in the camp library, with the focused attention of a man treating a language as infrastructure, something that would need to be solid before he could build anything else on top of it. His English became functional, then conversational, then something approaching fluent in the specific registers of farm work and daily life, which were the registers the Wyoming months had given him the most practice in. He could discuss weather, crops, machinery, and the general conditions of human existence with a vocabulary that was still accented but no longer approximate. He wrote to Henderson, the farmer, a letter in careful English, thanking him for the work and the trust and the lemonade and the oatmeal cookies that his wife had put on the table under the cottonwood tree on a summer afternoon that Emil expected he would remember for the rest of his life. Henderson wrote back 2 paragraphs, the handwriting of a man who wrote infrequently, saying that both his sons had come home and that the east field Emil had helped clear was producing well. He said nothing else specific but signed the letter, R. Henderson, and added below it, in handwriting that suggested it had been considered and then written anyway, "You were a good worker. Good luck over there." Emil read that line several times. He folded the letter and put it with his mother's letters in the inside pocket of his jacket. Dieter came to him 2 weeks before departure with the particular manner of a man who has something to say that he has been putting off for longer than was comfortable. He sat on the cot across from Emil's and looked at his hands for a moment, and then looked up. The performance of confidence he had maintained since the train platform in Wyoming was completely gone now, worn away by 18 months of evidence that had not cooperated with the performance. What was left underneath it was a 19-year-old from Munich who had graduated from school and gone directly into a war, and was now 21 and going back to a country that no longer existed in the form he had left it. He said, "I spent a long time being wrong." He said it simply, without drama, the way you say something you have been arriving at slowly and have finally reached the end of. He said, "I knew by October that I was wrong. I kept saying the other thing because stopping felt like losing something. But the thing I was afraid of losing was already gone. I just hadn't admitted it yet." Emil listened without interrupting, because Dieter was saying something real, and real things deserved the space to be said completely. He thought about the white posts on the edge of camp and the invisible cage and Otto's observation about the fence being honesty wearing a different face, and he thought about how long it took for a true thing to move from the mind to the place where a person actually lived. He told Dieter what he thought, which was that being wrong was not the problem, and had never been the problem. The problem was the system that had made them wrong before they were old enough to interrogate the lessons they were being given. The propaganda and the schools and the radio and the officers during training, all saying the same thing from every direction until the thing being said achieved the status of a fact rather than a claim. He said, "We didn't choose what we believed. We received it. The choice was what we did when we got here and the evidence started coming in." Dieter looked at him for a moment and then nodded slowly, and they sat in silence for a while, which was a different kind of silence from any they had shared before. The day of departure arrived on a gray October morning, 18 months after Emil had stepped off the train in Wyoming and turned slowly on the platform looking for the fence that was not there. The processing was efficient and thorough, as all American processing had been. Forms, signatures, the return of personal documents, the issuance of travel papers for the journey home. Emil stood in line and moved through each station with the patience of someone who had learned that the bureaucracy of a functioning system, however tedious, was itself evidence of a functioning system, and that a functioning system was not something to take for granted. He had 20 kilograms in his bag. He had packed it the night before with the careful selectivity of a man who had been thinking about this moment since the Christmas dinner and knew exactly what he was taking and why. His mother's letters, all of them, bundled and tied. Henderson's letter with its 2 paragraphs and its good luck over there. The English phrase book with its penciled German translations and his own 3 sentences written below them in the margin. A photograph taken by one of the guards in the summer. Emil and Otto standing outside the barracks in their camp jackets, squinting in the Wyoming sun, looking exactly like what they were. which was two men who had been changed by where they had ended up. A pair of wool socks, the ones from the Christmas dinner, worn but still warm. He looked at these things arranged in the bag and felt their weight, which was not their physical weight, but the weight of what they represented, which was considerable. Otto stood beside him in the departure line, his own bag on his shoulder, his English grammar book visible at the top. They had not discussed what was coming with much specificity. Otto was not a man who discussed things before they happened, preferring to address events at the moment of their occurrence with the appropriate response, rather than rehearsing them in advance. But he had said one thing the previous evening, sitting on his cot, in the last hour before lights out, that Emil had written down afterward in the margin of the phrase book. I came here a man who thought he knew the shape of the world. I am leaving as a man who knows the world does not have a shape you can be given. You have to find it yourself. Emil had written it down because it was true, and because true things, he had learned, required preservation. The truck took them to the train station, and the train took them east across America in reverse. The plains, the rivers, the factories, the cities, the harbor, and Emil sat at the window and watched it all go by with the attention of someone saying goodbye to something that had not been what he expected and had given him more than he had any right to receive. The country looked the same as it had on the way in, which was to say enormous and organized and unhurt, its infrastructure intact, its cities lit at night without blackouts, its people moving through their physical labor first, then administrative work as the occupation authorities organized the reconstruction and needed people who spoke English and understood how organized systems functioned. His English was good enough now to be genuinely useful, and his 18 months of watching how a functioning country administered itself turned out to be a form of education that had direct practical application in a country trying to remember how to function. He worked carefully and steadily, the way Otto had worked in the irrigation channels, moving at the pace that the task required rather than the pace that urgency or anxiety demanded. He wrote to Otto, who had returned to Cologne and found his railway system partially destroyed and his skills immediately needed in its reconstruction. Otto's letters were exactly as Otto's letters would be, precise, informative, occasionally dry, always accurate. He wrote that Cologne was rebuilding with the systematic efficiency of people who had lost everything and were applying all available competence to getting it back. He wrote that his English was now good enough to read the American technical manuals that the occupation authorities were distributing for infrastructure reconstruction, which he found useful. He wrote in the last paragraph of his second letter one sentence that Emil read 3 times. I think about the camp sometimes. Not with longing exactly, with the specific gratitude of a man who was shown something he needed to see at a time when he needed to see it. He wrote to Henderson once more, a longer letter this time, with his return address at the top so a reply was possible if Henderson chose to send one. He described Hamburg and the reconstruction and his mother's apartment and the work he had found. He described what it was like to return to a country that was learning, painfully and from the ground up, what it meant to be something other than what it had been. He thanked him again for the work and the trust, and for the 40 cents Carl had earned shooting gophers with a borrowed gun on a summer afternoon in Wyoming, which had been a small thing objectively and an enormous thing in every other way. Henderson's reply came 6 weeks later. 3 paragraphs this time, slightly longer than the first letter, the handwriting of a man who was making an effort. Both sons were home and well. The Eastfield was producing better than ever. Ruth sent her regards, and at the end, in the same considered handwriting as before, a man who works honestly deserves to be trusted. You did. I hope things come right over there. Emil kept that letter with the others, in the box on the shelf above his desk. His mother's letters, Otto's letters, Henderson's 2 letters, the English phrase book with its penciled translations, and his 3 sentences in the margin. He kept the photograph of himself and Otto in the Wyoming sun. He kept the wool socks, too worn now to wear but too significant to discard. These were the objects of his captivity, the material record of 18 months in a place that had been the opposite of what he had been told it would be. And he looked at them sometimes when the reconstruction was slow and the winter was hard, and the gap between what Germany was and what he had seen was large enough to make the work feel impossible. On those days he took out the phrase book and opened it to the margin where he had written the 3 sentences on the night of the Christmas dinner, in the hour after the singing and the wool gloves, and the woman who had said Frohe Weihnachten in 2 words of imperfect German. A country strong enough to be kind, an enemy treated as a person, a fence made of trust instead of wire. He read them and closed the book and went back to work. Because the sentences were true, and the true thing to do with a true sentence was to live according to it, which was harder than writing it, and more important and the only form of tribute that actually meant anything. Years later, when his grandchildren were old enough to ask questions, He told them about the camp. He told them about the train ride across America and the platform in Wyoming, and the guard who had told them they could take a walk. He told them about the white posts and the invisible cage and Otto's observation on the first night. He told them about the food and the farm and the shotgun and the Christmas dinner and the woman with the wool gloves. He told them all of it as accurately as he could, because accuracy was the only form in which the story had any value. A softened version would be pleasant, but a pleasant version would be dishonest, and dishonesty was the disease he had been cured of and had no intention of contracting again. And he told them the thing he had come to understand most clearly in the years since, the thing that had taken the longest to arrive at, and that felt the most permanently true. The strongest prison he had ever been in was the one he had lived in before capture, built from the inside, constructed entirely from things he had been told and had never examined. America had not freed him by removing his chains. It had freed him by having no chains to put on, by simply being what it was: abundant, confident, large, humane, and entirely uninterested in performing its own power for the benefit of the people it was holding. And letting the evidence of that reality do what evidence eventually did to a man who had decided, somewhere between the train platform and the Christmas dinner, that honesty was the only discipline worth keeping. The fence, he told them, was never made of wire. It was made of the lies you believed about yourself and about the people on the other side. And the only way out was for someone to be decent enough